episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. Ryan, this is a big day for us.
This is a big day. This is like a Bigfoot sighting.
This is sometimes you never really believe they exist, but today in the podcast room, in the High Ground podcast room, we have the legend, Glenn Longabaugh, joining us in person instead of being remote in a truck somewhere out in the field. You're actually taking time to come to the podcast room and visit with us in person. So, Glenn, welcome here.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
And you brought props.
I did.
So we'll give us a timestamp. We are sitting here kind of in the latter part of July 2022, and right now we are busy with a lot of fungicide application. And you have brought some for the listeners, I guess viewers on YouTube on our podcast. They'll be able to see some of these props. And tell us what you brought in here today.
Yeah, well, this is one of the props. I would really, as usual, I wasn't really sure what we were going to talk about today, and I've got a plethora of topics that I'd love to cover because it's that time of year, right? I mean, we can talk about sexual reproduction in corn.
Corn.
In corn, right? Hey, this is the high ground, right? This is the high ground.
That's
27 seconds.
That's cornography, right?
Yeah.
Cornography.
Okay.
Yeah. But you think about it, this is the time of year when we transition. We start thinking about the following year, thinking about our decisions going forward. Talking about sexual reproduction in corn and talking about the impact the fungicide can have on yields is one topic, but we could talk about wheat management because it's time to really start thinking about wheat. It's a great time to think about, why do we have successes and failures in wheat control? Right?
Okay.
And so those are topics that I came prepared really to visit about.
I'll tell you what, let's start with corn, and then we may clip it, and we may do another one. So we don't want to limit you on what you've got to say here about where we're at today, because
Sure.
you're passionate that we've got some things we got to get done now.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we've got a lot of fungicide applications being made, and we've got some fungicide applications that didn't get made, right? And I think that there was maybe some anxiety about the fact that we went into flowering in less than optimal conditions, right? So
Hot.
It was hot and actually got pretty drouthy in some places. Some places are still drouthy. So I don't want to be disrespectful for those folks that don't have a crop, right, because of drought conditions. Obviously, we want to be sensitive to that. But I would say that most growers are probably not aware that until we get to flowering, right, or at least within a week of flowering, corn is crazy resilient to drought stress, right? So until you get into that magical period of a week prior to flowering, corn can stand up to like 60% depletion with little or no impact on yield.
Wow.
And in fact, I would say that on a lot of years, especially in a year like this, where maybe a lot of the corn went in less than optimal conditions. Would you guys agree with that?
I would agree.
Yeah, I'm not saying we're a bunch of mudders, but man, the spring was difficult in spots, and we put in some corn that maybe we weren't proud of. Well, that corn was not rooted very, very deep at all. And so when we first started going into these, when we got into that first couple weeks without any rainfall, you noticed that the corn stressed really quickly. But yet it didn't really get much worse. And what it was is we were allowing the ground below that plant to get back to field capacity as opposed to being at saturation, which allows the roots to go down, which allows us to have more bank, right? So if you figure in this part of the world, we probably have an average about, 2 inches of usable moisture per foot. By allowing that corn to get into that 3rd and 4th foot, right, it actually almost doubled its capacity of usable moisture, right?
So in a way, the early season stress by making it develop larger roots possibly than it normally would have had to, the plant just by its own physiology, that helped?
Absolutely.
How's that, Ryan?
Absolutely.
I think you did well. Yeah, I like the way he says it.
Yeah.
So not long ago we had a meeting with the the internal folks at Premier and talked about the repercussions of drought stress and just all the things that go on physiologically within the plant. And that's probably a little longer than we have time for today. But I just think that it's important that growers recognize that when plants get under drought stress, there are several things that happen physiologically. You know, one of the first things that happens is the plant starts producing a lot more indoleacetic acid. And indoleacetic acid is really the way a plant communicates, right? It's part of its, it doesn't have an endocrine system, but it does use plant growth regulators to communicate from the tissue above to the roots below, and from the roots below to the tissue above, you know, what it needs. And so when the plant produces indoleacetic acid, the upper part of the plant, the part that's photosynthesizing, is saying to the lower part, it's not conscious, but it's communicating, and this is by a pretty elegant design, that, hey, we need more water. And the plant's response, typically below ground, is to put on more roots, right? Makes perfect sense. You get short on water, puts on more roots. But what's probably not well known is the fact that when you produce indoleacetic acid, it does communicate to the roots that it needs more roots, but the plant typically puts on more laterals and more root hairs in the same volume of soil that it already was exploring.
It doesn't find another plane. It stays right where it is.
Exactly. And so indoleacetic acid, even though adding more roots is possibly a good thing, oftentimes what happens is the plant then just mines out the soil that it already has root volume in. And then when it gets to that threshold of not getting enough moisture, the moisture really is gone. Right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about 60% depletion, if I had some soils here at different moistures, and we know this because we've trained a lot of folks on managing irrigation. And if I had 60% depleted soil here, you guys would swear it was oven dried. I mean, it would be absolutely, there'd be no color in it. It would be white and chalky, and yet corn can still oftentimes eke out enough to get by with, even at 60% depletion, or certainly at 40% depletion. But obviously, plants like to be at field capacity. And so, anyway, that early season drought stress often starts this cascade of events, right? Plant first produces indoleacetic acid, then as it becomes more stressed, it'll start producing ethylene. Typically, you'll see a reduction in photosynthesis. You'll see a reduction in respiration. You'll see, if it gets severe enough, it'll start producing abscisic acid, right? You'll see the free radical concentrations go up in the plant, or certainly within the cell, right? And these
What's the symptomology? What are they looking? What's the visual on that?
Yeah, so if you have free radicals being released in the cytoplasm of the cell, it'll actually look necrotic, right? Just like when you spray a PPO herbicide on soybeans, and you know the PPO itself doesn't cause necrosis. The PPO, you know, it's a protoporphyrinogen oxidase inhibitor. It basically inhibits the production of the enzyme that allows to dispose of waste from photosynthesis, right? And the waste from photosynthesis is what? It's superoxides, right? It's when we manage a field of corn, we're trying to exploit, or soybeans, we're trying to exploit the power of sunlight, right? And we're using that power to reduce, because it's a reduction reaction, CO2 into sugars, right? And when you do that, all that oxygen that was on CO2 has to go somewhere. Well, typically it's released from the above ground part of the plant as O2. But there is ozone, which is O3. There's tetraoxide, which is O4. There is hydrogen peroxide. I mean, there's a whole plethora of these, what we call superoxides. You guys, in humans, we typically talk about them being free radicals, right? And they typically cause premature aging in people. They also cause premature aging in plants. So ethylene and abscisic acid and these free radicals, these superoxides, are considered to be program cell death compounds, right? And
I just got to say for the record that every time you're saying right, Ryan and I are nodding our heads in agreement. So we have no idea to.
Well, when you talk. Well, there was a small prayer went up when he said, when it's released as what? And then he didn't hesitate long enough. He answered his own question, because I thought that's going to be, here's an edit.
You heard the crickets in the room.
Yeah. Well, so let me make this a little simpler. What growers maybe don't understand is that corn is designed to start killing itself off when it gets in less than optimal conditions. And you're probably saying, Glenn, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. But in reality, these programmed cell death compounds don't just kill the plant off earlier. In the plant, they actually accelerate maturation. That's the role. That's that intelligent design, right? So there's probably some folks out there that think that corn evolved this way, but I believe it was a creator that made such an elegant design that it would be this level of complexity, right? And I'm still way oversimplifying. But this is one of the reasons why we use fungicide. Besides just trying to control things like Physoderma, which we just found a field that was absolutely ate up here just a couple days ago, or gray leaf spot, or northern, or tar spot, or southern. I mean, there's a plethora of diseases out there, and I don't claim to be clairvoyant. I don't know which one is going to predispose corn, or if any of them will predispose corn, or if it will be a complex of multiple diseases that predispose the corn. I just know that when we spray fungicides on corn, that strobilurine component tends to reduce the effects of these programmed cell death compounds, right? So that's the primary reason why you use it, in addition to the fact that they control fungus, right?
So these diseases that they were trying to prevent right now with all the aerial application. If you're listening and you've seen the helicopters and planes and folks spraying really tall corn, that's what we're trying to do right now. Can you explain that? We may put that disease triangle up on the screen. Can you kind of explain how that interaction works?
Yeah. So in the absence of disease, we're trying to exploit the fact that it helps us if we have suboptimal conditions. Once we start talking about disease, then it really comes down to the disease triangle. And the disease triangle is not about whether you have a disease, it's whether a disease is going to become epidemic, right? And so it takes three things. One, you have to have a susceptible host. And most corn, most soybeans are susceptible to the diseases, the disease complex that we have here, right? Almost all corn is susceptible to southern corn, southern rust, even southern corn leaf blight. There's a lot of resistance to it, but you still will see those lesions. Gray leaf spot, northern, tar spot, right? There is some genetic differences across hybrids with tar spot, but to date, we don't have a test where we can say, oh, this one is resistant and this one is not. So until we have that assay, you have to assume that they are all susceptible and that the differences we see in a strip trial is probably just anecdotal, right? It's not really something that we can say, hey, this product is disease resistant. And so, normally you ask me what keeps me awake at night, and it's the normal things, right? Should we be buying inputs for next year? Should we be selling more corn? What's the price going to be this winter? But today, it should be the things that keep me awake are the guys that have gotten this position where it's like, you know what, I don't want to borrow any more money, or I don't want to spend any more money on this crop, and they're ready to abandon it, when in reality we have tremendous potential.
Well, that's, I think, when you were talking earlier about how we look at when the crop goes through a stress like that, we can see it visually, and in our minds, we kind of make the decision, right? Well, that doesn't look good. But then at the end of the year, we're kind of pleasantly surprised sometimes when we get to later rainfall and it comes through. And that kind of speaks to what you said about the yield. That story's not written yet until 2 weeks before pollination.
Yeah, typically it's 1 to 2 weeks prior to flowering, and then the really critical time is post-flowering, right? During early grain development. That's a time that we really don't want to see a lot of depletion in the soil, right? No more than 20 or 30% depletion, which means that you're getting enough rainfall that the corn is getting back to field capacity with some regularity. I mean, right now, most of Premier's area has had enough rainfall that we have recharged the soil. We have at least a couple feet of usable moisture. With 2 inches of usable moisture per foot, that's about a week per foot. So you probably have a couple of weeks of usable moisture. And you know what? If you've got corn that looks like this right here, where we're brown silked, I wouldn't say that the corn is made by any stretch, right? But I would say that the likelihood that you're going to have a huge amount of abortion on this ear is minimal, right? Now, there's a big difference between, this is probably a good segue to go into talking about sexual reproduction and, obviously, that's another really elegant process, right? Corn, people are always worried about whether corn is going to pollinate or whether it's going to flower. And we probably worry entirely too much about that because the way corn was designed, even though pollen is fairly vulnerable to hot, dry conditions, the corn was designed to shed pollen in the most, actually in the best part of the day, right? Typically, that little dip we get in humidity and that in the lowest temperatures of the day happens just right at or right after sunrise. That's actually when corn typically sheds pollen, and it's such a prolific system, right? The tassel itself probably has enough pollen. One tassel probably has enough pollen to pollinate most of the corn in southern Indiana, right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's a huge number. When we think we see pollen on leaves, what we're really seeing are clusters. We're either seeing the anthers or we're seeing clusters of pollen grains that have all stuck together. But a pollen grain only has to land on a silk, and these silks are exerting at 3 to 5 centimeters per day, which is probably 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches. They land on that silk, they germinate, they grow down that silk tube towards the ovule. They fertilize that ovule typically within about 12 hours. That now becomes an embryo, and typically what happens afterwards is the silk detaches from the kernel, right? So within 24 hours a day, the silk will detach. So if we're real careful about pulling the shucks back, and then we give it a good shake, right? We can do that ear shake boogie, and if a silk is still attached, these are kernels, right? That's actually coined from a friend of mine who used to talk about the ear shake boogie all the time. but you'll notice these silks that are attached are not pollinated. But this is a really small ear, right? We take this one that's at brown silk, and if I'm really careful about pulling the shucks back, I've got most of them off here. Because I don't want to pull the silks off. I want to shake them off. But if I shake it, you'll notice that there's hardly nothing really hanging. We're actually adding a few kernels down here at the bottom, but actually the kernels at the top, this thing is completely pollinated all the way to the top of the ear. Now, one of the things you'll often see, if we are having trouble with pollination, and there is some of that out there, where it's delayed pollination. And that's where maybe we planted it in less than optimal conditions, or it went through really cold period. And you'll have a condition, Ryan, that's called I'm just blanked out, but it's asynchronous pollination, right? And so normally corn would flower with a tassel first, and then within a day and a half, you would see the silk start to emerge. Sometimes in southern Indiana, when we've planted on years like this, you'll see the silks emerge sometimes 2-3 days ahead of the tassel, and because the silks exert at 3 to 5 centimeters per day, you'll see these big long whiskers hanging off the ear. Right? If they get to be 6-8 inches long, then that's a field that even if you're driving 60 mile an hour down the road, you probably ought to stop and run out and take a look. But what often happens is, even if the field is fairly sterile, right? Oftentimes there's a lot of sterility on the male side of these corn plants. They can oftentimes be pollinated even by adventitious pollen from other fields, right? And you'll often see that, again, corn, when it comes to the male side, is crazy prolific. And but
well,
anyway,
it's because there's, anyone who's familiar with the seed business and how that works, I mean, the male rows they detassel. They detassel the females,
That's
and
correct.
they leave that one row. You see those. You see that in the seed field. That gives you an idea, if anyone's ever seen a seed field, how much pollen is actually available from those males, because it's such a small percentage of the actual ones. And we used to refer to that as missing the nick whenever we would get silks way out and no tassels shedding at that point in time. So that's a bad day in seed.
It is, and that is actually the right terminology. That they do consider pollination. They do call that the nick in seed production. But we were talking about fungicide use, and what I would suggest is that growers go out, make sure they were pollinated. Now that we've got lots of moisture in the ground, if they have not decided to use a fungicide, right? Let's talk about the value of fungicide to grain fill. I already said that it's really important that we, whether we have optimal environmental conditions or not after flowering, that's still a really critical time. But one of the real discoveries that I think goes untalked, it kind of goes maybe underdiagnosed or we just don't talk about enough is the value of fungicides on grain fill and actually grain weight, right? So if you go out and I was out with one of your account reps earlier in the week, and we looked at some corn, and it was about 16 kernel rows around, and it was a fairly modest population, and so the ears were really, really long. They were probably in excess of 40 kernels long. But let's say they were 38 kernels long, and it was 16 kernels rows around, and just for easy math, let's say it was 30,000 kernels. If you divide that by 90,000 kernels, which is what I was told when I was in college, that there is an average of 90,000 kernels per bushel, you'd end up with about 200 bushel corn. And I think that's probably, I think that's a fair guesstimate. And yet in the last few years, we have seen these modest kernel counts yield considerably more. And I think a big part of that is really attributed to our use of fungicides, right? Because what do fungicides do? They help protect the plant from pathogens that cause it to be prematurely, to die prematurely or prematurely senesce. And so here's what I'd challenge you with. We know that sometimes we will have as few as 55 to 65,000 kernels per bushel because hybrids either produce, maybe it's a genetic thing that they produce really heavy kernels, or maybe it's the fact that we just are managing more intensely. But if you would take that same ear that was 16 by 38 at the same population, and you allow it to live a little longer and produce a little bit larger seed, let's say 70,000 kernels per bushel, guess how much that would influence yield? Almost 60 bushels per acre. So when we see these dramatic impact of 20, 25 bushels, it's the thing about fungicides, it's so subtle, right? If a fungicide added 2 inches to an ear, to the length of an ear,
you could all see it.
Everybody would see it. We could all be like, oh my gosh, you got to have fungicide, right? It would just go, it would just be a no-brainer. But because we're talking about the depth of the grain, oftentimes it goes unrecognized. And I just think that's a thing that sometimes growers overlook. And we all fall into this trap this time of year is, man, I don't want to spend any more money. But this is a good year. I know the market was off yesterday, but there's still a lot of profitability in this crop because we have a crop. And remember that there's a big part of the Corn Belt that does not have a crop. I have friends in Nebraska that do not have a crop. I have friends in Kansas that had a crop. They may not have a crop because of less than optimal conditions, typically drought and heat. And so between that and the fact that we have places that didn't really go in good and that will often have a long tail, I think there's a lot of potential for growers at this latitude, right? And when you have that kind of opportunity, it's really kind of shame on you if you don't take advantage of it. So my role is not just to make you spend money. My role is to help you raise the biggest crop you can, because the difference between the winners and the losers is most of the time yield.
Yeah.
Right?
I have a question on, I talked to a grower the other day, and he said, I need to get my fungicide on, but he said, I have got silks out. I've got purple silks. I've got some that's not even hardly ready yet. He said, and all that's in the same field. So where's that decision from? Because we know it's good, and we know there's a definite decreased ROI at some point in time of putting fungicide on, probably on either side of whatever R3 is. So why don't you talk us through that for a minute?
Yeah, Ryan, what a wonderful segue.
I haven't even seen your notes either. So. Well, I'm still feeling pretty good about my Miss the Nick comment. Yep. Actually felt smart on one of your. I felt pretty good today.
You notice how quiet I've been.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't want to draw any attention.
I kind of won today. I'm winning already.
Yeah. So if you noticed, I've had my notes covered up all morning with my props, right? So I can't see my notes anyway. But I'm so glad you said that, because fungicide timing is a huge. I mean, that has a huge impact on the utility or the efficacy of fungicides, right? I am such a believer in fungicides, I almost always use 2 passes. And I like for my first pass to be sometime after the rows close in, because I want that fungicide on the crop and not on the ground. And you're probably saying, well, that's a pretty broad statement. Well, oftentimes it comes down to logistics, right? But ultimately, I want a fungicide on early, not because there's such a huge amount of pathogen pressure early. Maybe a little bit of anthracnose, maybe you'll discourage a little physoderma, but the main reason why I want it on early is so that I can delay my R application, right? That reproductive application, if we make it truly at R1, which is when the silks come out, we are still 50, 55 days, certainly we're 60 days from physiological maturity, but we're probably, 40, depending on the maturity of corn. I plant a lot of full season corn. I'm 50, 55 days probably from it not being eligible for yield loss, right? And so by delaying that R application and knowing that a fungicide lasts 28 days or so, 4 weeks, then I can almost ensure that my R application is going to last long enough that it takes away that peril. It takes away that risk of the plant prematurely senescing and me losing any significant yield, right?
So you'll make a first application in corn at around
anywhere from V8 up to V12, right? This year, I planned on doing it with ground application, but honestly, I know this sounds weird, but I can't hardly stand to run over corn. Right?
Yeah.
I just hate that feeling, and it's like, what? I don't know enough about drones. Most of your, most of your intellect doesn't come from academics. It comes from experience.
Yeah.
And most of your experience comes from bad experience. And I thought, what? I probably better, if we're going to talk about drones, we're going to talk about helicopters, we're going to talk about airplanes, probably should have some experience with those. And so I have a good friend that has a drone business in Illinois. I had him come over, and we ran, a lot of my first pass actually went on with drones. And that way I didn't have to track up the corn because it kind of got away from me. And anyway, where we were at was not talking about the application method. It's about using the first pass to delay the second pass. And so let's talk about the timing here just briefly, because that'll maybe make more sense, right? When we get to flowering, we're about halfway through the corn's life cycle, maybe a little past half, but it's fully 60 to 65 days from physiological maturity. When it flowers, that's R1, that's silking. R2 is typically 7 to 10 days down the road. That's blister, right? That's where this ear would be, right? It's not really a roasting ear yet, but it's you can still see the silk scars very, they're very evident. That little dimple, that little knob on there where the silk had been attached. That's 7 to 10 days down the road. When we get to brown silk, which was where this ear was at, right? We are now at milk, right? That's another 7 to 10 days down the road. And at this stage, we are still probably, 35, 40 days from physiological maturity, but we're only about 30 days away from R5, where we probably are not going to lose any appreciable yield, even if the plant is predisposed at that stage, right? So if we can get to here and make a fungicide application, or even R2.5, right? This is R3, and we make a fungicide application with a top tier product that has lots of persistence, right? And these are products like Trivapro or the Miravis brands or the Voltima BASF products. Those products are persistent enough that they should almost eliminate our chance of having any appreciable yield loss to some kind of disease setting up housekeeping, right?
which in a lot of the cases recently has been tar spot, correct?
Yeah, so north of us has been tar spot. Here, it's probably been more southern rust, right?
Okay.
And southern rust and tar spot are totally different diseases. In contrast, southern rust is a transient disease. It doesn't overwinter here. It typically blows in from the south. It sets up housekeeping sometime in mid-reproduction. And because it's polycyclic and because it has a really short latent period, in other words, from the time it infects to the time we see the lesions, it's really, really quick on southern rust. It blows up really fast and then completely predisposes the plant. Tar spot, on the other hand, is a resident disease, right? So it can overwinter here. It is polycyclic, but it has a much longer latent period. And when when tar spot sets up housekeeping, you don't necessarily know it for some time. But when you do know it, it was such a prolific sporulator, and the stromata, the fruiting bodies on that disease, must produce a tremendous amount of spores, and they must be pretty active at getting in the plant, right? Because I saw some last year on late planted corn where the corn went from just absolutely breathtakingly beautiful to necrotic in about a 2-week period, right? Well, that tells me that, when it first set up housekeeping, that plant still looked beautiful. And it wasn't until, 2 weeks later when the lesion showed up and basically took all that photosynthetic capacity away that the plant was predisposed. And by the way, this was probably 125 bushel corn in a year when most of the corn was almost twice that, right?
Wow.
Or somewhere, 40, 50% better than what that was.
So Glenn, so if you spray at V10, you got more leaves coming, and when you spray, you're only protecting the leaves with the fungicide that are there. How does that delay? Explain that.
Yeah, so it would not delay. The thing it wouldn't do is it wouldn't delay southern rust because it's going to blow in and infect the upper part of the plant. But what you are doing is all those diseases that start at the bottom of the plant and work their way up, you're basically resetting the clock.
It's like gray leaf spot.
Absolutely, gray leaf spot, northern physoderma. I mean, everybody thinks that these diseases live as obligate parasites, and they do in our crop, but they also have a alternate life cycle, the ones that overwinter here, where they live through the winter and sometimes even a couple of years as what we call saprophytes, right? And so these fungi were designed, or maybe they evolved that way, but they are designed to make a living and to propagate themselves even with rotation. Rotation definitely thins the herd, right? When you think about the disease triangle, and it takes 3 things, right? It takes a susceptible crop, it takes inoculum, and it takes favorable environmental conditions. I don't know that we ever really covered that.
We stopped at the host, yeah.
Yeah, we started into that, but these diseases were designed to make a living, right? Otherwise, they would be gone.
Yeah.
Even if you do rotation. So oftentimes corn diseases will make a living in corn residue, and yes, the following year there would be lots and lots of inoculum. 2 years down the road there might be less, but they were designed. They oftentimes have an alternate life cycle that even has a completely different. The hyphae doesn't look the same. Even the fruiting structure doesn't look the same, right? And they may not even produce the same kind of offspring, right? So instead of a basidiospore, it might be a teliospore, right? Like I said, even the fruiting body is completely different. So.
Well, on this topic, and given that we're going to release this here in about 2 days, while aerial applications are being made, and we have some later planted corn that's still not to R1. So what's your advice for growers right now?
Yeah, so the plains have not been crazy busy. I mean,
No.
I dropped some chemistry off a couple days ago, and they told me they thought it would be Saturday. This is over in the western part of the state, but I saw the warehouse was starting to fill up with a lot of different products, right? And so what I would suggest is get with your account rep, make a decision, choose a brand, and get it in the queue so that you can get it covered, right? If you've got corn that's already flowered and you're at R1.5, in other words, you've got, it's pollinated, and maybe they're not quite to blister or they're right at blister, that'd be R1, or just past R1. Those fields I would definitely get in the queue so that they're treated before the disease really has a chance to set up housekeeping. It kind of depends on whether you had a first shot or a second shot.
Yeah.
If you had a first shot, then you've got some time. If you didn't have a first shot, then it needs to be pretty close to R2, or a little early. R1, R2.
What's the latest?
R1 is silking, R2 is blister.
What's the latest they can make an application? And
yeah, that's really interesting that you said that. A good friend of mine, Jason Roth, works up in northern Indiana. He lives in Michigan, but he did some trials in northern Indiana a couple years ago on tar spot. And he made some, what he thought were R5 applications, because R5 today, universities have changed the way we describe staging in corn, right? It's called, the process is called phenology. And it used to, until maybe 2017, 2018, R5 was when you had all the kernels were fully dented. And at that point, you're about 2 weeks away from physiological maturity. And even if the plant died at that point, you would have no appreciable yield loss. R5 today, because the universities have mostly stacked hands on, hey, we're going to change phenology to dent is now a dented kernel, which is maybe only 7 to 10 days past R4, right, which is dough. And so today, if you have a plant, your question was valid. How late can we still see a response to fungicide? He saw 20 plus bushel advantages on what would have been, late R4 or early R5 applications in a tar spot environment. Now, recognize a tar spot is crazy aggressive, right? And you rarely hear me try to encourage, Ryan, growers to make fungicide applications because there's some impending epidemic on the horizon, right? I think that's the cheapest way to sell fungicide. I think there's much better reasons to use fungicide, and that is that there's plenty of diseases that could affect us, and that there's this physiological response, right? Fungicide use is a great decision, even without trying to create this atmosphere of fear that you're going to lose the crop automatically, right? That's a pretty common thing. But I would tell you this: tar spot does scare me, because once you see it, it's almost too late because of this big long latent period, and it's such a prolific sporulator. If you see some lesions of tar spot, if you're not comfortable identifying it, you have your local account rep get out there and take a look at it. And if you do have tar spot, that field needs to be treated immediately, because it is even worse in my mind than what is southern rust, right?
Okay.
Southern rust, it takes a few generations really, and we get some time there normally to kind of head it off. I'm not sure we'll get that same grace when it comes to tar spot.
One last question on this topic, as we're doing late applications in corn. What do you think about insecticides?
Yeah,
Since we're in there.
Yeah, that's a great question. In soybeans, we can't get enough insecticide on. In corn, it's a little easier, right? The critters that we're after in corn are typically the silk feeders, right? Like corn rootworm beetles, Japanese beetles, that sort of thing. And corn rootworm beetles are easily killed, right? If we use Tundra, bifenthrin, lambda-cyhalthrin, which would be grizzly or warrior, we can kill those guys pretty easy, and it's not expensive. I think most everybody puts an insecticide in. I can't tell you what the value of that insecticide is, because I think most of the value on a corn application is still from the fungicide. In soybeans, I'm not convinced that the biggest value, at least on a single fungicide application, isn't actually from the insecticide that we put in with it.
Yeah.
But that would even be on a late season herbicide pass. Even if fungicide's not a piece of your game plan, the insecticide probably should ride.
Absolutely. And I'm not convinced that we necessarily kill them all either, right? So when it comes to like Japanese beetles, or we don't have as many hemipteras or stink bugs in corn as what we do in soybeans, but I'm not convinced that we kill those. What we typically do is we kind of run them out of the field, and we maybe make your neighbor's infestation a little worse, but I'm not convinced that we kill them. Oftentimes you'll see them on the ground for a short period of time. It's made them woozy, or it's obviously it affects their nervous system, is what it does, and I think they typically move on. But things like bifenthrin are pretty persistent, and so it makes it unattractive for a while. And if you think about it, the biggest peril from things like Japanese beetles is really silk clipping. Well, if you can just run them off for a couple days, right? The silks emerge at 3 to 5 centimeters per day. It only takes maybe a day to get it pollinated if you're actively shedding pollen, and then the silks stop growing anyway, right?
Yeah.
So probably we make a bigger deal out of Japanese beetles than what they really are. But every year there's a spot somewhere where the Japanese beetles just set up housekeeping, and You've got 20 beetles per plant around the perimeter of the field, and you've got a beetle per plant on the interior of the field, and it actually does impact yield.
Okay.
But I think that's probably the rarity. That's the exception, not the rule.
All right, I think that's about enough for this topic. We're going to do another topic, but for this topic, Glenn, I think that's about enough for this meal.
Yeah, you guys warned me out already.
Yeah, you've got another one. So yeah, and you've tapped my knowledge on corn. So
Yeah, you got quiet after the nick. You didn't say much else after that.
I was just here to score a touchdown. I wasn't here to win the game.
That's right.
Well, Ryan, Glenn, this is another episode of The High Ground powered by Premier Companies, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks.